You've probably been told this your whole life without anyone ever saying it out loud. That capitalism is just how things work, that it's inevitable, that without it, everything would fall apart. And if you ever question that, you were made to feel naive, unrealistic, or dangerous. But feeling trapped inside a system doesn't mean the system is permanent. It usually means it was designed to feel unavoidable. Capitalism is not a natural law, it's an economic system. The U.S. Constitution does not require private ownership of everything, profit-driven healthcare, or billionaires as the only means of survival through wages. What the Constitution does protect is political participation. Speech, assembly, collective action. Capitalism came later. It was chosen, expanded, and enforced over time, especially after the Industrial Revolution. And America has already changed its economic system before. Public schools, fire departments, Social Security, labor protections, Medicare, minimum wage laws, none of those destroyed democracy. They expanded the number of people who could survive long enough to participate in it. So when people ask, is capitalism required for America to exist? They're asking the wrong question. The real question is, what kind of economy allows democracy to actually function? Because democracy isn't just voting. It's whether people have the time, health, housing, and safety to participate at all. This isn't about tearing everything down. It's about remembering that systems are built by people, which means they can be changed by people. And you don't start by fighting capitalism as an idea. You start by changing the conditions of daily life. Work, rent, healthcare. That's where power is easiest to build. And that's where this conversation actually begins. When people hear the word anti-capitalist, a lot of them flinch. Not because they love capitalism, but because they've been taught that questioning it means giving up freedom, that anti-capitalism equals chaos, that it means no voting, no rights, no choice, that it's automatically anti-democracy. That fear didn't come from nowhere, it was trained. Here's the distinction that almost never gets explained. Capitalism answers the question, who owns the economy? Democracy answers the question, who governs politically? Those are not the same thing. You can have capitalism without democracy. History is full of authoritarian states with corporations. And you can have democracy with reduced capitalism, public ownership, strong labor power, limits on how much wealth can translate into political influence. Anti-capitalism does not mean no voting, no freedom, or no individual rights. It usually means the opposite, that essential needs aren't controlled by profit, that workplaces are more democratic, and that wealth doesn't buy political power. In fact, unregulated capitalism often undermines democracy. Money floods elections. Corporations gain more influence than voters, and people are pushed into survival mode. Too exhausted, sick, or scared to organize. When participation becomes a luxury, democracy becomes theoretical. And you can still vote, but the system stops responding. So anti-capitalism isn't anti-democracy. It's often an attempt to protect democracy from being hollowed out. Because a system that requires people to be desperate in order to function will never allow them to govern freely. And if democracy is supposed to mean anything, it has to include the conditions that make participation possible. When people hear less capitalism, a lot of them imagine collapse, empty shelves, no innovation, a gray, joyless world where nothing works. That fear isn't accidental. It's what happens when profit is framed as the only thing holding society together. But most people already live inside systems that aren't fully capitalist and rely on them every day without questioning it. A less capitalist democracy doesn't look like a sci-fi dystopia. It looks familiar. Healthcare treated as a public good instead of a commodity. Housing treated as infrastructure, not a speculative asset. Education fully funded so access isn't determined by debt. Strong labor protections, shorter work weeks, guaranteed paid leave, workplaces where unions are normal, worker cooperatives where employees actually govern their labor, employee representation on boards, fewer meaningless jobs built around constant growth, more emphasis on safety, stability, and rest. Markets still exist, small businesses still exist, innovation still exists. What changes is the moral center of the economy. Profit stops being the supreme value. People don't have to earn the right to stay alive. Survival isn't used as leverage. Exhaustion isn't a feature. This kind of system goes by many names: social democracy, democratic socialism, mixed economy, labor-centered democracy. The labels vary, the values don't. Democracy works better when people aren't drowning. A less capitalist democracy isn't about eliminating effort or ambition. It's about removing desperation as a governing tool. Because when people are stable, they participate. When they participate, power becomes accountable. And when power is accountable, democracy stops being theoretical. That's not radical, that's functional. A lot of people hear all of this and think, okay, but I'm tired, I don't have a movement, I barely have energy. That feeling matters because systems don't stay powerful by convincing people they're wrong. They stay powerful by convincing people they're small. That change requires money, platforms, or perfect coordination. So people wait, and waiting becomes paralysis. Here's the truth that actually makes change possible. Power is easiest to build where it touches daily life. Not everywhere, not all at once. Work, rent, healthcare. Those are pressure points. They shape whether people can rest, organize, or even think clearly. Anti-capitalism becomes real when it changes the terms of everyday survival. If you try to fight the system as an abstraction, you burn out. If you fight a boss, a landlord, or a bill, you can win. Counterpower doesn't start with ideology. It starts with shared conditions. You don't need a movement yet. You need a we. That looks like asking, what are the 5 things people complain about the most? Who's affected? Who makes the decision? Then one simple ask, will you sign this? Will you show up? Will you join a call? Concrete demands create collective identity, not the other way around. This is how power actually grows. Small, coordinated actions that prove change is possible. Once people experience one win, their sense of what's realistic shifts, and systems that rely on hopelessness start to crack. You don't start by being powerful, you start by acting together. That's how counterpower forms, quietly, locally, and faster than people expect. One of the fastest ways people burn out is trying to do everything at once. Be the organizer, the caretaker, the strategist, the protester, the fixer. That pressure isn't accidental. Systems survive by convincing people that change requires superhuman effort. So when exhaustion hits, people blame themselves instead of the structure. But real movements don't run on heroes. They run on layers. Anti-capitalist systems don't replace profit decides with chaos. They replace it with people deciding together across different lanes. That means organizing happens in parallel. One layer stabilizes people, another changes conditions, another locks wins into place. You don't choose one, you stack them. The first layer is mutual aid, not charity, infrastructure, ride shares, food support, childcare swaps, eviction funds, medical debt help. Mutual aid keeps people afloat long enough to fight. The second layer is labor and tenant power. That workplace committees, tenant associations, collective demands, escalation together instead of suffering alone. This is where the terms of daily life start to shift. The third layer is policy and electoral work. Not voting and hoping, but voting as an extension of organizing. Policy is how wins stop being temporary. Each layer solves a different problem. Mutual aid reduces desperation. Organizing builds leverage. Policy makes change durable. When one layer weakens, the others hold. That's how movements last, not by running faster, but by distributing the weight. You don't need to do everything. You need to be part of something that's built to hold people. That's how counterpower becomes sustainable. A lot of people win a campaign and then feel the crash afterward. The policy passes, the demand is met, and somehow a year later, you're fighting the same fight again. That's not because the work failed. It's because regulation alone can't hold against systems designed to extract. If profit can still be pulled from basic needs, power always finds a way back in. This is why ownership matters. Rules can be bent, enforcement can be defunded, but ownership changes who the system answers to in the first place. A less capitalist democracy doesn't just regulate markets, it reduces how much profit can be extracted from survival. That's where structural change actually lives. This doesn't mean everything becomes state-run overnight. It looks like worker cooperatives where workers govern their labor, community land trusts that stabilize housing costs, public or municipal banks that decide on lending priorities locally, participatory budgeting, where residents control public spending, sectoral bargaining that sets standards across an industry, not job by job. Ownership is the long game. It's how you stop winning the same battle over and over. When people control the conditions they depend on, leverage shifts permanently. Changing ownership doesn't erase conflict. It determines who holds power when conflict arises. Instead of begging institutions to be fair, people build systems that are accountable by design. That's how counterpower becomes self-sustaining, not louder, not purer, but structurally harder to ignore. Because democracy can't survive on temporary wins. It needs foundations that don't disappear the moment attention shifts. One of the most painful patterns in organizing is watching people turn on each other right when power starts to feel possible. Movements fracture, trust breaks. Someone gets labeled expendable for the greater good. That's not a personal failure. It's the oldest tactic power uses to survive. Because capital doesn't win by being stronger. It wins by keeping people separate. Wealth concentration depends on division, race, citizenship, job title, education, who's considered deserving and who isn't. If people are separated, demands stay small. If they're ranked, some can be sacrificed. And if they're isolated, no one has to be answered to. That's why divide and conquer isn't a metaphor, it's an operating system. So coalitions need one non-negotiable rule. No one gets thrown under the bus to win. That doesn't mean everyone agrees on everything. It means victories aren't built on exclusion. Practically, this looks like labor groups partnering with tenant unions, disability, justice groups shaping demands from the start, faith communities offering space and protection, student groups adding pressure and numbers. Coalitions share calendars. They show up for each other's fights. They repeat the same 3 to 5 demands until they're impossible to ignore. Unity isn't aesthetic, it's strategic. When people refuse to be separated, leverage multiplies. Power can dismiss one group. It struggles against many moving together. Coalitions don't eliminate conflict. They make it survivable. And systems built to divide begin to fail when people stop competing for crumbs and start acting like their futures are linked. That's when counterpower stops being fragile and starts becoming durable. Most movements don't fail because people stop caring. They fail because the most caring people collapse. Burnout gets framed as a personal weakness, a lack of discipline, a failure to keep going. But exhaustion isn't random. It's what happens when systems rely on urgency instead of rhythm. Sustainable change doesn't run on constant crisis. It runs on cadence, a pace that people can return to, roles that rotate, asks that stay human-sized. Without rhythm, organizing becomes survival theater. With rhythm, it becomes infrastructure. A sustainable cadence looks like this. On a weekly basis, schedule one meeting, one action, and one mutual aid drop. On a monthly basis, plan one public event, one training, and one recruitment push. Quarterly, plan one major escalation that actually shifts leverage. Rest isn't a reward you earn later, it's now part of the strategy. That's how people stay long enough to win. And if you're starting small, here's a real 30-day beginning. Week 1, choose one issue, map who's affected, start a group chat. Week 2, 10 one-on-one conversations, identify 3 leaders. Week 3, set a clear demand and take a collective action. Week 4, escalate pressure, bring in 10 more people, set the next demand. That's it. You don't need perfection. You need repetition. Counterpower grows through consistent, shared effort, not heroics. When people have rhythm, they stay. When they stay, power becomes accountable. And when accountability becomes normal, democracy stops being theoretical. This isn't about doing everything, it's about doing something together, long enough for it to matter. That's how systems change. If this helped you see the system more clearly, share it with someone you trust. Not to convince them, to start a real conversation. What's one pressure point you see in your life right now? Work, rent, healthcare, debt. Name it in the comments. And if you want more grounded, nervous system aware analysis like this, follow, like, and subscribe at NeuroNoor Healing on YouTube and Facebook, where we're building clarity with our outrage, not just collapsing under its pressure.